The first thing anyone remembers is the silence. Not the roar, not the speed, not the checkered flag, the silence. It came in the middle of a straightaway under the Florida sun with grandstands full of fans who had paid good money to see history. At 190 miles per hour, engines are supposed to scream. They're supposed to vibrate through your rib cage and rattle your teeth. They're supposed to remind you that man is fighting physics and winning. But on that day, the sound just stopped. And in that sudden vacuum of noise, something else filled the air. Fear. What happened next wouldn't just change a race. It wouldn't just cost a team millions of dollars. It would force one of the most powerful racing organizations in America to tear up its own rulebook. And it all started with an engine no one thought was dangerous, at least not at first. In the early 1970s, American racing was in a strange place. The muscle car wars had burned bright and fast. Detroit had spent the late 60s locked in a horsepower arms race, pumping out big block monsters that could barely fit under their own hoods. But by the time the 70s rolled in, emissions laws, oil crises, and rising insurance costs were strangling performance. Yet on Sunday afternoons, one sanctuary remained: NASCAR. In the American South, stock car racing wasn't just a sport, it was identity. It was church with gasoline, and for manufacturers like Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, it was survival. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That wasn't a slogan, it was strategy, and Chrysler needed a win. By 1969, they were desperate. Ford had muscle, GM had resources. Chrysler had a shrinking budget and a reputation slipping through its fingers. Inside a quiet engineering department in Highland Park, Michigan, a small group of men were handed a simple directive: build something they can't beat. They didn't start with a blank page. They started with a loophole. The result was an engine that would become both legend and liability. The 426 Hemi. Officially, it was just another V8. Unofficially, it was a war machine disguised as a production engine. Hemi referred to hemispherical combustion chambers, a design Chrysler had experimented with before, but this time, it was refined, weaponized. And when it arrived at Daytona, it didn't just compete. It annihilated. In 1964, the Hemi-powered cars finished first, second, and third at the Daytona 500. It wasn't close. The rest of the field looked like they were towing trailers. Ford teams protested immediately. Quiet phone calls were made. Executives flew in. Because this wasn't just a win, it was domination. And domination makes enemies. Chrysler had done their homework. To qualify under NASCAR rules, a certain number of street versions had to be sold to the public. So Chrysler rushed limited production Hemi cars into dealerships. They were loud, expensive, temperamental. And suddenly, NASCAR faced a problem. If this engine stayed legal, Ford and GM would have to spend millions catching up. The sport would become an arms race again, one that smaller teams couldn't afford. So in 1965, NASCAR made a move that shocked fans. They banned the Hemi. Not permanently, not publicly framed as punishment. They just quietly changed the rules. The required production numbers skyrocketed overnight. Chrysler couldn't meet them. The Hemi was out. And just like that, an engine had forced a rewrite of the rulebook. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. For Chrysler engineers, the ban felt personal. They hadn't cheated. They had played by the rules, every line, every comma, and now the rules had shifted beneath them. So they did something bold. They walked away. In 1965, Chrysler pulled out of NASCAR entirely. No factory support, no funding, no official entries. For fans, it was a shock. For NASCAR, it was a warning. Because television money was growing, sponsorship dollars were creeping upward, and losing a major manufacturer wasn't good optics. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. Chrysler didn't want fairness. They wanted dominance back. In 1966, NASCAR relented. The Hemi returned. And when it did, it was angrier. The revised 426 Hemi wasn't just fast, it was terrifying. Drivers described it like holding onto a live wire. The power delivery was brutal, throttle response instant. On superspeedways like Daytona International Speedway, it created gaps so wide they looked staged. Ford scrambled to respond with its own high-performance engines. Budgets ballooned. Teams that couldn't afford the new technology started disappearing. The sport was changing. What used to be backyard mechanics and moonshine legends was becoming corporate warfare. And in that war, engines were weapons. But weapons have consequences. By 1969, the rivalry escalated beyond engines. Chrysler introduced the Dodge Charger Daytona, a car with a nose cone and a rear wing tall enough to cast a shadow over the trunk. Ford responded with the Torino Talladega. These weren't subtle tweaks. They were aerodynamic missiles built to exploit NASCAR's stock car rules. Speeds climbed. 190 mph, then 195, then whispers of 200. Fans loved it. Sponsors loved it. Broadcasters loved it, but NASCAR executives did not, because at those speeds, one small mistake becomes catastrophic, and the engines were pushing harder than ever. The Hemi wasn't just winning races, it was stretching the limits of what tracks, tires, and safety standards could handle. Drivers were reporting terrifying instability and crosswinds. Tires were failing under sustained high-speed loads. Behind the scenes, insurance companies started asking questions. What happens if a car goes airborne into the grandstands? What happens if 200 mph becomes normal? What happens when horsepower outruns safety? The pressure mounted, and in 1971, NASCAR made its most controversial decision yet. They changed the rules again. Engines would be restricted, displacement limits were tightened, aerodynamic specials were effectively outlawed. The era of winged warriors and unrestricted Hemi dominance was over. Officially, it was about competition balance. Unofficially, it was about fear. The Hemi had forced NASCAR into a corner, let it continue, and the sport risks becoming a high-speed science experiment. Ban it again, and risk losing manufacturers and fans. So, they chose control. Chrysler, once again, scaled back involvement. The golden era of factory-backed Hemi terror faded into memory. But the financial fallout lingered. Development budgets in the late 60s had soared into the millions. Serious money for the time. Smaller teams folded under pressure. The cost of staying competitive had doubled, then tripled, and it all traced back to one thing: an engine that refused to lose. Yet the story doesn't end in the 1970s, because the 426 Hemi didn't die. It went underground. Street racers, collectors, muscle car fanatics. The engine became myth. Cars equipped with it skyrocketed in value. Decades later, original Hemi cars would sell for 6, even 7 figures at auction. The very engine NASCAR once tried to contain became a badge of honor. But here's the twist. Every major racing series today has strict engine templates, spec motors, restrictor plates, standardized components, cost caps, technical inspections so thorough they border on forensic science. Those systems weren't born from harmony. They were born from chaos. From the moment one manufacturer discovered how far the rules could bend, the Hemi wasn't illegal. It was just ahead. And being ahead in racing has consequences, because once one team pushes the boundary, everyone must follow, or the sport fractures. That's the paradox. Innovation drives racing, but too much innovation threatens it. And somewhere in the halls of NASCAR's headquarters, that lesson is etched deep. You can almost imagine the meeting room: executives in suits, engineers with grease under their fingernails, lawyers calculating liability in dollar signs, all asking the same question. How fast is too fast? How powerful is too powerful? How much dominance is too much? The 426 Hemi forced them to answer. It wasn't just an engine, it was a catalyst. It exposed the fragility of stock car racing's identity. It revealed how thin the line was between spectacle and danger. It proved that rulebooks are not sacred, they're reactive. And maybe that's the real legacy. Because every time a racing organization tweaks regulations after one team gains too much advantage, they're responding to the same fear that surfaced in the 1960s: the fear of imbalance, the fear of escalation, the fear of silence at 190 miles per hour. That silence wasn't mechanical failure. It was the moment officials realized the sport had outrun itself. And here's what makes this story unsettling. What if they hadn't intervened? What if the Hemi era continued unchecked? Would speeds have pushed past 210? 220? Would safety have evolved fast enough to keep up? Or would the inevitable tragedy have rewritten the rules in blood instead of ink? We'll never know. Because the rulebook changed first. Today, The Hemi name lives on in modern performance cars. It's marketed with nostalgia, sold as heritage, a callback to glory days of American horsepower. But buried beneath the branding is a quieter truth. Once upon a time, that name scared an entire sport. It forced billion-dollar organizations to admit they didn't have control. It showed that sometimes innovation doesn't break the rules, it exposes them. And somewhere, in a private collection or under the hood of a meticulously restored muscle car, there's a Ford 26 Hemi that still carries that memory. Not just of speed, not just of victory, but of the moment racing had to ask itself, are we building competition? Or are we building something we can't contain? The answer was written into a new rulebook, but the question still echoes, because every time an engine fires up on a Sunday afternoon, somewhere in the distance, there's a reminder, the next rewrite might already be waiting under the hood.